What would you do if a neighbor parked their $60,000 luxury SUV in your garage without asking, then fined you for something you didn't even do? Welcome to Tomato Tales, where the stories are real and the drama is even realer. It was just another long, exhausting day working as an electrician. I had been on my feet for 12 hours straight, and all I wanted was to get home, relax, and put my feet up. But as I pulled into my driveway, something caught my eye. There, in the middle of my garage, sat a pristine silver Audi Q7, blocking my tools, my space, my garage. It was the kind of car that makes you pause and think, how did this happen? This wasn't just a case of someone parking in the wrong spot. It was someone who felt entitled enough to park in my garage without asking. Now, I've worked hard for everything I've got. Years of saving, working overtime, and living frugally just to be able to buy a modest home. This house wasn't much, but it was mine. And that garage, that was my sanctuary. It wasn't a parking lot for someone else's fancy car. But there it was. The car alarm blared, and I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. My space had been taken, and the audacity of it hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a random mistake. It was Rebecca Kingston, the HOA president, who had taken it upon herself to use my garage like it was her personal parking space. I didn't just want to yell. I wanted to take action, but this time I didn't react like everyone would expect. Instead of storming over and confronting her, I pulled out my phone and started recording. "To be clear," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you're admitting that there's no emergency parking rule and you're using my private garage without my permission?" Rebecca's smile faltered, and in that moment I knew I had her. She tried to grab my phone, but I pulled it back, staying calm. "What's the matter, Rebecca? Can't handle a little accountability?" She was speechless, trying to come up with a response, but the truth was out. She had crossed the line, and I wasn't going to let it slide. But Rebecca wasn't done yet. What she did next took things to a whole new level, and it didn't just stop with me. Stay tuned to see how her power trip led to something much bigger. If you want to see how this suburban battle unfolds, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Have you ever encountered someone who uses their position to push others around? That's exactly what Rebecca Kingston was doing, and it was time for me to fight back. After catching Rebecca in my garage, I thought the worst was over. I expected her to apologize, maybe feel a little guilty, and then move on. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Rebecca wasn't the type to back down, especially when it came to the HOA. That night I was settling in, thinking the whole situation was behind me. I was just about to open a cold drink when I saw it, a letter taped to my front door. I tore it open, expecting something minor. What I found was far worse than I could have imagined. It was an official HOA violation notice. It read, "Failure to maintain community standards. Garage door left open overnight. Fine, $75. If not resolved within 48 hours, fine escalates to $200. My jaw nearly hit the floor. Garage door open? Yes, I had left it open, but I had been unloading after a long shift. Everyone in the neighborhood did it. But this was no ordinary mistake. It was Rebecca using her position to fine me for something so trivial that it made no sense at all. I tried to stay calm, but I felt the pressure building up. This wasn't just an innocent mistake. This was Rebecca overstepping, trying to make me feel like I had no power. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. She was using the HOA as a weapon against me, and I couldn't just let it slide. I reached out to Derek, my old college buddy, who was now a real estate lawyer. When I read him the notice, he just laughed. "Jake," he said, "she just handed you a gift. She's fining you for something she caused. You've got the perfect case for harassment and abuse of power. He explained that the HOA documents, bylaws, and authority were public records, and I could dig into them to see where their power ended and where their abuses began. I knew I had to find out exactly what they were allowed to do. The next day, I went down to the county courthouse to get a look at the HOA records. As I pulled dusty files from old cabinets, the musty smell of aged paperwork filled the air. I was determined to find out if Rebecca's fine was even legal. After some digging, I found something surprising. The HOA had a clause that vaguely gave board members power to fine residents, but the wording was so unclear that it could easily be misinterpreted. It didn't specifically authorize fines for something as trivial as my garage door being open. I smiled to myself. It was clear now. Rebecca had been using the HOA's vague rules to push people around, and I'd just found the smoking gun. Rebecca wasn't backing down that easily, and her next move would shock me in ways I never expected. Stay tuned to see how this escalated to something much bigger. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates. By now, I had the evidence. I knew Rebecca was abusing her position as the HOA president, using vague rules to target people like me. But I didn't realize just how far she was willing to go until I came home one evening to find her at it again. It was a Friday when I pulled into my driveway after a long week. My body was aching from yet another 12-hour shift, but I was looking forward to a quiet evening with Emma, my daughter. She was visiting for the weekend, and we had plans to work on her treehouse project, something we'd been building together for months. But as I pulled into my driveway, I saw something that made my blood boil. Rebecca's Audi Q7 was parked in my garage again. Only this time, it wasn't just sitting there. It was blocking more than half of my space. My tools and equipment were pushed aside with no regard for my personal property. I couldn't believe it. Was this really happening again? I walked up to my front door, still holding my frustration in check. And there she was, Rebecca, standing on my front porch like she owned the place. She didn't even seem the least bit bothered by the fact that she was once again trespassing in my private space. I tried to stay calm, even though the urge to confront her was overwhelming. "Rebecca," I said, my voice steady. "What's going on? This is my garage. Again." She flashed me that all-too-familiar smile, as if she was doing me a favor by allowing me to speak to her. "Oh, Eric," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "The HOA board has decided to do some community improvements, and I just need to park here for a little while longer. Think of it as, well, as a favor to everyone." I looked at her in disbelief. "A favor? This is my property, Rebecca, and you don't have the right to park here without asking." But instead of apologizing or offering an explanation, Rebecca stood there, cool as ever, as if this whole situation was perfectly normal. "I'm still reviewing the bylaws," she said, brushing me off like I was the one overreacting. I couldn't believe it. The more I talked to her, the more she tried to twist the situation to make me look like the problem. It wasn't just the car in my garage anymore. It was a full-blown power trip, so I did what I had to do. I didn't let her walk away with the upper hand this time. I went inside, grabbed my phone, and called Derek. I told him about the latest incident. Derek's response was quick. "Jake, she's not just bending the rules anymore. She's breaking them. And if you're going to take her down, you need to document everything. We can't let her use her position like this." I had the proof, but I still had to outsmart her. And Rebecca's next move? Let's just say it was the most dangerous one yet. Stick around to find out how I turned the tables and caught her in the act. And remember, if you're enjoying the journey, hit that subscribe button to keep up with the drama. By now I knew that confronting Rebecca head-on wasn't going to solve anything. She was too entrenched in her position, and every time I tried to stand up to her, she'd twist the rules and make me look like the bad guy. But this time, I had something she didn't expect: the law on my side. I spent the weekend reviewing the HOA bylaws and digging through the county records. It became clear that Rebecca wasn't just overstepping her bounds. She was breaking the rules. The documents I pulled from the county office confirmed that the HOA had no authority to fine or harass residents over trivial matters like garage doors being left open. And as for her using my property without permission, that was a clear violation of my rights. I could feel the weight of the situation building, and I knew I had to act fast. Derek had already given me solid advice: document everything. If I was going to take Rebecca down, I needed to gather as much evidence as possible. And so I started to track every interaction, every email, and every notice she sent. But I wasn't just going to sit back and wait for her to slip up. I needed to take a more proactive approach. One afternoon, I decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who had been a victim of Rebecca's petty enforcement for months. Mrs. Chen had been cited for things as trivial as having a few decorative items in her yard, items that any reasonable person would call decorative, but to Rebecca, they were an eyesore. Mrs. Chen's frustration had been building for a while, and when I asked if she had any documentation, she handed me a thick stack of violation notices. "This woman has been harassing me for over a year," Mrs. Chen said, her voice shaking. "She's trying to force me out of my home. I don't know what her problem is, but I'm tired of it." I flipped through the papers, seeing each violation clearly laid out, each one baseless, each one a direct attack on Mrs. Chen simply because she didn't fit Rebecca's vision of perfection. This was the proof I needed. I wasn't the only one Rebecca had targeted. I spent the next few days gathering more information. Tom, my neighbor, had his own story to tell. He'd been fined multiple times for parking his work truck in his own driveway. Apparently, Rebecca had decided that commercial vehicles degraded the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was a pattern of harassment, coordinated attack on anyone who didn't fit Rebecca's idea of the perfect community. By the time I had enough evidence, I knew what I had to do. I was going to take Rebecca down. The storm was brewing, and Rebecca had no idea what was coming. But I wasn't just fighting for my garage anymore. I was fighting for everyone she had bullied. Stay tuned to see how I turned the tables with a plan that no one saw coming. And if you've been following this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. What do you do when you've got the evidence, the support, and the drive to bring down a bully who thinks they're untouchable? Well, you hit them where it hurts, and Rebecca was about to learn that lesson the hard way. After gathering all the evidence, I was ready. But I knew that if I went after Rebecca directly, she'd just use her position to deflect, manipulate, and twist the narrative in her favor. No, I needed a plan, something that would leave no room for her to wiggle out of. It was time to hit her with everything I had. I spent the next few days strategizing with Derek, my lawyer friend. He'd been a huge help throughout this entire ordeal, offering legal advice and insights on how to navigate the maze of HOA bylaws. The key, he told me, is to be methodical. Rebecca won't back down easily, but if you catch her in the act, she won't have a leg to stand on. So I decided to take action on multiple fronts. First, I needed to put Rebecca on notice that I wasn't afraid of her. I started by carefully documenting every instance of her abuse, from the fines to the baseless parking complaints. I gathered witness statements from Mrs. Chen and Tom, who were more than willing to back me up. Each piece of evidence I collected made Rebecca's position more precarious. But it wasn't just about playing defense. It was about taking the offensive. I knew that Rebecca relied on the HOA board to back her up. So I decided to get in front of them before she could twist the situation any further. I attended the next HOA meeting, ready to confront Rebecca head-on. The room was filled with the usual faces, mostly retirees, empty nesters who didn't really have a stake in the fight, but there were a few members who knew something was off. I could tell by the way they were watching Rebecca as she stood at the front of the room, acting like she had complete control. I waited until she finished presenting some meaningless updates about the aesthetic quality of the neighborhood. Updates that had no bearing on real issues like safety or property rights. Then, I stood up. "Excuse me, Rebecca," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think it's time we all take a look at the real issues in this neighborhood. You've been abusing your power as HOA president to target residents who don't fit your perfect vision for the community. You've been fining people for things like having decorations in their yard and parking their work trucks in their own driveways. And you've been using your position to force people out of their homes." The room went silent. The board members looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Rebecca's face turned bright red, and I could see the panic starting to set in. "Don't you dare accuse me of that," she shot back, her voice shaking with rage. "I've done nothing wrong." I stepped forward, holding up a folder filled with documents. "This says otherwise. Here's the evidence: violation notices, emails, and witness statements from people you've targeted." I turned to the board. "I'm not just talking about my case anymore. This is about the entire neighborhood. Rebecca's abuse of power has gone unchecked for too long, and it's time we hold her accountable." The tension in the room was palpable. Some members of the board were visibly uncomfortable, while others tried to act like they didn't want to get involved. But I wasn't backing down. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was for everyone Rebecca had mistreated. But this was just the beginning. Rebecca had more tricks up her sleeve, and she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Stay tuned to find out how I took this fight to the next level. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay in the loop. What happens when a bully is cornered and has nowhere to run? Rebecca was about to find out. I had the evidence, the support, and the resolve to take her down once and for all. But she wasn't going down without a fight. After the HOA meeting, I thought for sure that Rebecca would back off. I had caught her in the act, exposed her abuses, and forced her to face the consequences. But Rebecca wasn't the type to fold easily. No, she had other plans. The very next day, I came home from work to find an official letter taped to my door. It was another HOA violation notice. This time it was for something even more ridiculous than the garage door: my lawn. Apparently the grass had grown slightly longer than the acceptable height, and I was being fined again. I couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened, Rebecca was still trying to find ways to push me around. It was as if she couldn't accept that I wasn't going to back down. But this time, I wasn't just going to take it. I called Derek immediately and told him about the new fine. His voice was calm but firm. "Jake, it's time to go on the offensive. You've got the evidence, but now you need to take it public. If you let her keep getting away with this, it'll never stop." Derek's advice was clear. I had to escalate this to the authorities. The situation had gone far beyond just a personal dispute over a garage. This was a case of systemic abuse, and Rebecca needed to be held accountable. The next morning, I made a call to the county office, reporting Rebecca's continued harassment and illegal use of HOA powers. I also reached out to a local news outlet, sending them a detailed email with all the evidence I had gathered. It wasn't just about taking down one petty tyrant anymore. This was about making sure no one else in the neighborhood, or anywhere else, had to deal with this kind of abuse. But Rebecca wasn't going to give up without a fight. She launched a full-on smear campaign against me, sending out emails to the entire neighborhood, painting me as the troublemaker who was trying to tear the community apart. She even went so far as to claim that I was undermining the authority of the HOA. and that my actions were hurting property values. I could feel the weight of the pressure mounting, but I wasn't going to let her twist the narrative. I had one last card to play, and I wasn't about to back down. I went to the media with everything, my story, the documentation, the witness statements. I told them about how Rebecca had used her position to bully residents, fine them for absurd reasons, and make life miserable for anyone who didn't fit her vision of a perfect neighborhood. The reporters were interested, and soon my story was picked up by a local news station. It didn't take long for the whole neighborhood to start paying attention. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before began coming forward. Mrs. Chen shared her story. Tom shared his. People were finally waking up to the reality of what Rebecca had been doing behind the scenes. The pressure on Rebecca was building, and she knew it. She tried to backtrack, calling emergency HOA meetings, trying to rally the board members to support her. But it was too late. The truth had already come out, and there was no escaping it. With the media involved and the pressure mounting, Rebecca's world was about to come crashing down. But she had one final card to play. Would it be enough to save her? Stay tuned for the thrilling conclusion, and make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. What happens when the walls finally close in on someone who's used their power for so long? Rebecca Kingston was about to find out. Everything she had built to maintain control was starting to crumble, and the truth was out in the open. The pressure on Rebecca had reached a boiling point. The media was now involved, and the story of her abuse of power had made its way across the community and beyond. Neighbors were no longer staying silent. The HOA, which she had once controlled like a puppet master, was turning against her. Rebecca was no longer the untouchable figure she had once been, but she didn't go down quietly. In a final desperate attempt to hold on to her position, Rebecca called another emergency HOA meeting, this time with the entire neighborhood invited to attend. She was trying to rally the remaining board members to her side and create a spectacle, but the truth had already spread too far. As I walked into the meeting, I could already sense the shift. The usual sycophantic nods from board members had stopped. I took my seat at the back, trying to stay out of the spotlight, but it didn't take long before Rebecca saw me and called me out, her voice dripping with a mix of anger and desperation. "Jake," she said, her tone sharp and accusing, "you've turned this entire neighborhood against me. You've exposed our private matters to the public. How do you expect anyone to trust you now?" I stood up and the room fell silent. "I've done nothing but stand up for what's right," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You've been using your position to manipulate and bully people for months. I've just given the people you've hurt the chance to be heard." Rebecca's face turned red. She was losing control, and everyone in the room could see it. She tried to shift the blame, throwing around accusations about how my actions had damaged the community. But the room wasn't having it. More and more people stood up to speak out, sharing their own stories of harassment and mistreatment at her hands. Mrs. Chen, Tom, and others joined me, telling the board how Rebecca had overstepped and used the HOA as her personal tool for power. But it was too late for Rebecca to change the narrative. The truth had come out, and the community was done listening to her lies. The board members, who had once blindly supported her, began questioning her leadership. Some even turned to me, offering their apologies for not speaking up sooner. I could see Rebecca's entire world start to fall apart. She tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear that the walls were closing in. Her carefully crafted empire, built on control and intimidation, was crumbling right before her eyes. But Rebecca wasn't ready to give up just yet. She had one final desperate card to play, and it was something no one saw coming. Stay tuned to see how she tried to claw her way back, and whether it was too little too late. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with the final showdown. When you've been cornered, there's only one thing left to do: fight dirty. But even Rebecca's desperate final move couldn't save her. After that fateful HOA meeting, it seemed like Rebecca was finished. The community had spoken. The board members had finally seen through her facade, but Rebecca wasn't ready to admit defeat. In fact, she had one last desperate card to play. The very next morning, I received a call from Derek. His voice was steady, but I could tell something was off. "Jake, you need to be prepared for what's coming next," he said. "Rebecca's pulled some strings and now she's going after you legally." I froze. "What do you mean?" "She's filed a lawsuit," Derek explained. "She's accusing you of defamation, of spreading false information about her and the HOA. She's trying to get you to back off by throwing some legal weight your way." I couldn't believe it. Rebecca was going to use the legal system to try and silence me after everything she had done. She had just crossed the line from petty tyrant to full-blown vindictive villain. But I wasn't about to back down. Derek and I immediately started preparing for the legal battle. We gathered all the evidence I had: emails, documents, witness statements, and recordings. Everything. Rebecca's lawsuit was weak, but I knew she was counting on intimidating me into backing off. She wasn't going to get away with it. As the days went by, Rebecca became more aggressive. She sent out legal threats to neighbors who had spoken out, trying to intimidate them into retracting their statements. But the more she pushed, the more the neighborhood rallied behind me. Then, just as Rebecca's case was about to go to court, I got a call from the local news outlet. They wanted to do a follow-up story on the HOA scandal. They'd heard about Rebecca's legal threats, and were interested in exposing how she was abusing the legal system to silence those who dared to challenge her. It was the perfect opportunity to turn the tables on her once again. We agreed to an exclusive interview. That evening, the cameras rolled and I laid it all out. I told the story of Rebecca's reign of terror over the neighborhood, how she had used her position to manipulate, bully, and fine residents for the most trivial offenses. I talked about her attempt to use the legal system to shut me down, and how she had threatened other residents to keep quiet. The next day, the story aired. Rebecca's last play had failed, and the community knew it. But her desperation would lead her to make one final catastrophic mistake. Stay tuned to find out how her world came crashing down. And if you've been following this journey, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for the explosive conclusion. When someone's world is about to collapse, they'll do anything to keep it together. But sometimes the harder they try, the faster it all falls apart. Rebecca thought she could silence me with a lawsuit. But what she didn't count on was the overwhelming force of truth and community support. After the news story aired, everything changed. The very public exposure of her abuse of power hit her like a ton of bricks, and the consequences were swift. The day after the broadcast, I received a call from the HOA board. It wasn't one of Rebecca's usual allies. It was Harold, the retired teacher who had always quietly disagreed with Rebecca's methods, but never had the courage to speak up. "Jake," Harold said, his voice shaky but resolute. "I've had enough. We've all had enough. The board's meeting tonight, and we're voting on whether to remove Rebecca from her position as president. I don't want to be the one to do this, but it's time. The community can't survive with someone like her in charge." It felt surreal. I had spent months fighting this woman, and now it looked like the end was finally near. I couldn't make the meeting myself, but Derek, who had been watching the situation closely, called me as soon as it was over. "She's out, Jake. The board voted to remove Rebecca. She's done." The relief I felt was immediate, but it was also bittersweet. The damage she had caused couldn't just be undone with one vote. People had been hurt, harassed, fined, threatened. Rebecca had taken so much from them, and it wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. But the real shock came just hours later. I was sitting with Emma, watching her build her latest treehouse design, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, one of the neighbors who had supported me all along. "You're not going to believe this, Jake," it read. Rebecca's house is in foreclosure. It turns out she's been hiding some pretty serious financial issues. The news just broke. She's in deep trouble. I couldn't believe it. It was like the universe had turned the tables on Rebecca. Not only had she lost her HOA position, but now her personal life was unraveling. Rebecca's financial troubles had been buried beneath the surface for years. She had been living beyond her means, using the HOA position to manipulate the neighborhood for her own personal gain. She had even used her power to try and force people out of their homes, all while building a facade of wealth and control. But as the truth came out, the cracks in her carefully constructed life were exposed. The banks had foreclosed on her property, and within weeks her McMansion was sold at auction for a fraction of its value. Rebecca's downfall wasn't just about losing power. It was about facing the consequences of her actions. And while the community celebrated, there was still more to be done. Stay tuned to find out how the neighborhood rebuilt itself and what happened to Rebecca in the end. And if you're enjoying the ride, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for the final chapter. Sometimes, when the universe decides to make things right, it does so in ways you never expect. For Rebecca, her downfall wasn't just about losing her HOA presidency. It was the price she had to pay for years of manipulation and control. By the time Rebecca's financial troubles came to light, the community was already rallying behind the changes that were happening. The removal of Rebecca from the HOA board was just the beginning. It wasn't just about getting her out of power. It was about taking back control of the neighborhood from someone who had used her position to tear it apart. With Rebecca gone, the HOA held a meeting to discuss next steps. It was a pivotal moment for the neighborhood, and everyone knew it. The board members who had remained silent for so long were now ready to act. Harold was voted in as the new president, and he promised transparency, fairness, and respect for all the residents. The first thing he did was review the HOA's policies, making sure that no one else could misuse the system like Rebecca had. He set up regular community meetings, where residents could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. It was a fresh start for Clearwater Heights, but while the neighborhood was moving forward, Rebecca's life was spiraling further out of control. In the days following her removal from the HOA, news of her financial struggles continued to spread. It turned out that she had been using her real estate dealings to fund her lavish lifestyle, inflating the value of homes in the neighborhood to flip them for profit. But the most devastating blow came when the local news station ran an expose on her fraudulent activities, connecting her to several illegal practices that were now being investigated by the authorities. It wasn't long before the truth came crashing down on her. Rebecca's actions had crossed a legal line. She was facing charges for property manipulation, financial fraud, and misuse of HOA funds. Her once impressive life was now in ruins. By the time the legal consequences caught up with her, Rebecca had lost everything. Her real estate license was revoked, her personal assets were seized, and she was left with nothing but a mountain of debt and criminal charges. Rebecca's downfall was complete, but the community had been forever changed. What happened next wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice and rebuilding what had been broken. Don't miss the final part of the story and how Clearwater Heights became stronger than ever. Hit that like button and subscribe for the conclusion you've been waiting for. When the dust finally settled, Clearwater Heights wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a community. And it was stronger than ever. Rebecca had lost everything: her power, her home, and her reputation. Her manipulations and lies had caught up with her, and as the legal consequences rolled in, she found herself isolated, facing the fallout from years of abuse. But for the rest of us, it was time to rebuild. Not just the HOA, but the spirit of the neighborhood itself. It didn't happen overnight. There were months of work to do. The community had been fractured for so long under Rebecca's reign of fear and control. But now, there was a sense of unity. With Rebecca gone, the neighborhood felt lighter. It was like a weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. Harold, the new HOA president, worked hard to make sure the bylaws were fair and transparent. There were no more hidden rules designed to target specific residents. He set up a community fund to help anyone facing financial hardships due to Rebecca's fines and bullying. It was a small but meaningful gesture that showed the neighborhood was in it together. Even more importantly, the neighbors who had stayed silent for so long began to speak up. Mrs. Chen, who had been too afraid to fight back, became an outspoken advocate for fairness and justice in the community. Tom, who had been wrongly fined for parking his work truck, now volunteered to help organize neighborhood events. People who had once felt powerless found their voices, and together, they started to shape a new future for Clearwater Heights. As for me, things started to feel normal again. Emma's treehouse was finally finished and she loved it. We spent weekends working on projects, without fear of Rebecca showing up to measure our grass or fine us for some ridiculous infraction. The best part? We had become a real community. Everyone looked out for each other. No longer was the neighborhood divided by fear of the HOA or by Rebecca's oppressive rules. It was a place where families could thrive and enjoy the simple things in life. And while I knew that Rebecca's fall from grace wasn't something to celebrate, the changes that followed were something to be proud of. Sometimes standing up to a bully takes more than just confronting them. It takes standing together as a community, fighting for what's right, and refusing to let anyone tear that down. The story of Clearwater Heights wasn't just about one man standing up to a bully. It was about an entire neighborhood reclaiming their power. So the next time you face adversity, remember what happened here. Sometimes the smallest actions lead to the biggest changes. Thank you for following along with this story. And remember, the fight for what's right never ends.